occasions. The most obvious is a Facebook project where, the deal was happening, but nobody was willing to disclose the details of the deal, and it was a pretty significant public investment in dollars. And I think there's a valid criticism to be laid upon us when our goal is to be transparent with how we deal with tax dollars. So do you feel like this balance gets us there? Do you feel comfortable with that balance? I mean, I'm always going to be probably the one who errs a little bit on the side of being as transparent as possible with any kind of public financing.
I think the balance gets us there because, again, the benefit is for the property owner or the developer. It's not so much that we're withholding information as much as we are not necessarily sharing their information until such a time that it comes before the board and needs an approval. So it's not that we're keeping anything secret as much as we're just controlling the release of that information such that it doesn't affect the negotiation and or whether the project moves forward.
And so one of the concerns from my perspective is how far down the road do we get without knowing the specifics and being asked to indicate whether we're supportive or not. But it looks like in your flow chart, that could be pretty early on based on some sort of fundamental criteria that we're looking for.
That would be the first public meeting. You would have the initial release of information. And obviously, between that time and when you give final approval, details may change. But you would have at that point what the goals are that are being met, how they're being met, early indications of what the costs and the details of the project are. And so it really just gives us that initial step of being able to discuss with you as board members of whether you even want us to proceed with it without letting the property owner have to disclose that information publicly.
Thank you. And just for my fellow council members, I want to share with you one of the concerns I continually have about the challenges we have with recruiting business to our community and the ability to support those businesses and employees long term, because generally high-paying jobs don't return revenue to the city. Property tax returns revenue to the city. So I think that's a nuance that we have to be really aware of as we go down these roads, because it's very tempting, I think, to say, wow, we're going to get 120 high-paying salary jobs. Fewer than 10% of those will live in Salt Lake City. And so looking at how we provide public services with our council hats on to that company when they're bringing employment, and I'm not trying to diminish the importance of high-paying salaries either, but it's certainly a balance, and it's not the only factor that should be a consideration when we're looking at businesses locating in our city. Thank you.
Thank you. Looking at the clock, I'm making a decision that we are going to take item number 4 before land disposition policy, proceeds policy off this agenda and bump it to October, because I would really like to take straw polls on everything that is in your folders. So if we can do that, and I've asked Jennifer to join us if you've got questions about any of the questions that we've raised about policy. And let's start off with the first one. The question is whether or not the policy if we should amend it in this section in 5.1 to add clarity and confirm that the board has the final approval authority when using this particular tool and can say no for any reason. So,
And Madam Chair, if I could just make a note of clarification. Obviously, this was written very quickly, so it probably doesn't have all the context that it needs to. It's not that the policy doesn't allow for the board to be the final authority, but I think in many of these deals, just to your point of setting clear expectations both for the developer and for the city from the get-go, I think there could be added clarity that would make it clear that, the board reserves the right to, and we haven't worked on wording yet, but if the council or if the board was interested, we could work with the attorney's office on the appropriate wording, but to make it extremely clear in the beginning from the get-go that this is not a given, that, this is a potential tool that ultimately the board has the authority to say yes or no to.
And just to add some clarity with Utah Title 17C, it's very clear that any tax increment reimbursement deal needs to be approved by the board by resolution. So whereas the loan program, you've delegated authority for the finance committee to approve loans at 500,000 or lower, you can't do that with tax increment reimbursement.
Thanks
But
for
we
that
can
clarification.
we can definitely add language to make that more clear.
So is there discussion on this? I'm hoping we can go through this with somewhat expeditiously, but I don't want to cut off good conversation and getting questions answered. So with that, I will take the first straw poll on the sheet of this. Does the board wish to amend the existing policy and all supporting materials to make it clear that the final approval authority for any tax increment reimbursement proposal, including single property community reinvestment areas, CRAs, rests with the board and in line with state law? Any discussion about that?
This
Okay.
is just stating what's already there, basically, then?
And just confirming that locally we're in line with what the state says. We've had a problem in the past of not always being aligned with state law.
I think the other thing just to add is the final authority of the board to approve this is implied. And a lot of times when developers are sort of rushing to sort of make their deal work, I think they don't always, they assume the best case scenario, which is that you wouldn't put together a tool unless the board was going to approve it if you met all the criteria. But ultimately, if a business meets all the criteria, it's still up to the board to say yes or no to the business, even if they meet all of the criteria. And so we found in other city incentive packages, it makes sense to make extra clear upfront for zoning, for example, that just because you can put together an application for a rezoning doesn't obligate the city council to say yes to a rezoning. And so it reduces frustration on the back end to make it abundantly clear on the front end that's, I don't know if Cindy.
Cindy?
Just another quick addition is, and not necessarily relating to RDA, but in other areas, we get a situation where you have people calling the council office saying, this is all done. All we need is council sign off. And so they are viewing the council as a rubber stamp. And what you've taught us is that you're not a rubber stamp. So a lot of these things that Jennifer has raised is to get that into writing.
Does that give us some clarity? So those in favor of the straw poll as I stated it, thumbs up. Any opposed? Okay, it is 6 in favor and 1 not present. Next item, capital expenditure requirement. There's a desire by some board members that the developer's security of other government incentive loans not count toward the 12 million capital investment, expressing a desire that it be truly new investment expansion in the market. For example, would it qualify if these sources were from other government loans and incentives? And the straw poll on that would be, do we wish to clarify the terms of this requirement for a single property CRA deal and discuss how the local business meets the minimum $12 million in capital expenditures? So we want to delve into how they're meeting that minimum. Is that something we want in policy? Is there
Can we
questions?
request
Yeah.
either Danny or Laura to speak to this, and then if there are pros or cons that they can imagine immediately on this proposal?
From staff perspective, we don't have any problem with stating that the $12 million has to be owner investment capital,
New investment.
that there can be other funding sources involved in the project, but those are on top of that $12 million. So that's how we've clarified it, and we're comfortable with making that requirement.
Great.
Okay, those in favor, thumbs up. Any opposed? Stan and Aaron? Okay, thanks. You weren't here. Okay, thank you. 6 in favor, 1 abstention. Turning to the next one, the annual application limit. And I know, Jennifer, do you want to give a little background on this?
Yeah, so the RDA staff memo goes into this a little bit, that they're proposing to limit the number of applications that they would process per year to 4. Staff workload is a huge driver of that, obviously. One other concern or option that was raised in one of the small group meetings was to consider it from a monetary value perspective. That probably doesn't take into account the staff workload as well, because you could probably have a lot of applications for low dollar amounts that would probably overtax staff. But that was just one other thing that we raised, just to make sure that the council members who had met in small group meetings concerns were heard. So, but the RDA staff is proposing 4 per year to start.
So the straw poll is just whether or not we want to explore the options to limit or constrain the use of the tool. And so it's not,
And maybe you could straw poll whether or not you support the RDA staff's recommendation of 4 per year, or if you wanted to view it a different way.
okay, so let's do that first.
Fair?
Yes.
Could I, before we straw poll this, maybe there were others, but this was a concern that came up in my meeting, that I wanted us to be really frank about the reality of the shift in that money, that those funds from, if we don't have the same kind of flow chart as we did in the small group meeting that had some hypothetical dollar amounts attached to it, but it's $50,000 hypothetically or more a year that would come out of the general fund that we would be giving back through this reimbursement program. And that's a significant amount. Like when you add it up, it gets to the kind of money that we get really desperate for when it comes to the budget. So I just want us to be really cognizant that we are shifting money out of the general fund into these possible scenarios. And it's
Danny, did you want to address
2
that?
points to that, if I could. Number one, I think the point is well made in terms of one of the other items on this list is what the potential percentage would be from the city contribution. And so I think that has to factor into this conversation as well, because obviously that drives the dollar amount. But I think in terms of when you look at tax increment, we need to keep in mind that we're not talking about existing dollars. We're talking about potential future dollars. And so we need to be aware that each of these projects, when we go into them, we freeze the property taxes where they're at right now, and that's the base year. So the city continues to get everything that they're getting right now off of the property in terms of supporting the general fund and the services. And what we're talking about here is the potential for new property tax revenue, and even that, going back to my first point, a percentage of that. And so you're looking at the potential of generating property tax revenue that doesn't exist today, as well as the city potentially getting a piece of that additional increment so that they can have that benefit the general fund. And then obviously after the 15 or 20-year life of the project, the city gets 100% of it. And so I just want to make it clear that we're not taking existing funds from the general fund as much as we are deferring the potential for an increase to the general fund.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Danny, is it a fair assessment to say, however, that in some of these situations, just by the mere factor of increasing the size of a business or the number of employees, we could actually increase the cost of providing services to that location? So do you factor that in as you're looking at this percentage piece at all?
We don't necessarily do a direct comparison or factor, but I think that's something that you take into account in terms of what the city's benefit or percentage should be of the project.
So I appreciate that, you're talking about future tax dollars, but the reality could be that we could be required to provide additional public services to
Right.
these facilities almost immediately upon them opening or completing.
You are. You're always getting that as a building gets bigger or more employees or more impact on the roads, that's an impact. But you're also getting the potential of higher sales tax, or
Right.
that they're doing public improvements, or that their new building will potentially have less of an impact because they've upgraded services or fire response or alarm. So
Sure.
and again, those are very hard to directly compare, but I think that does have to become part of the conversation over what part of the city would get. And you could look at that on a case-by-case basis, that obviously depending on the proposed use, it could represent a higher impact on police, whereas something else may have a minimal impact. So yes.
Thanks. And if I may, Madam Chair, one of the challenges that the county faced, in particular over big box developments, and I know this is a little bit different, but in many ways those were sort of property specific, CRAs or CDAs. What they faced was that as soon as the tax increment expired, the company would move, box up, move, close down the Walmart, move down the street to the next deal. What ability does the city have to prevent that from happening in these situations? Are we just perpetuating a 15-year renegotiation of a tax increment program?
You could, but I think the benefit that you have is number one, a lot of those deals, the reason they hurt the city is because they took the sales tax, whereas we're dealing with the property tax. And so to the extent that the building remains, depending on who that tenant is, you will still get the benefit of the property tax, number one. Number two, I think what you have is the potential that as those properties move on, yeah, you could have a redevelopment that needs to occur within the project itself. But to the extent that you're addressing goals that you want to accomplish within that 15 or 20 years, that's where you should be looking to get your benefit. You should not be looking at year 21 for the city to get the benefit as much as if we're going to give up our property tax revenue, what are we getting for those 15 or 20 years in the meantime?
And have we considered, Madam Chair, can I jump in here?
Yes, please.
A tiered structure on our reimbursement percentage so that the first 5 years is 100% and we ratchet down every 5 years?
We haven't looked at the tier. All we've done at this point is leave open the possibility that it may be less than 100%.
There's a question that's related to that a couple of ways down, and it came up in one of the small group meetings as something that staff was willing to consider in terms of, is the assumption that Salt Lake City's participation is 100% and then it kind of is negotiated down from there, or do you set the expectation that Salt Lake City's participation is some other percent, 50 or whatever, and then you negotiate up based on tiers or, you know, whatever public policy goals are achieved with the project.
That's absolutely where I was going with that.
And I don't know if the staff has had the time to do much, research on developing what that could look like, but if the board was interested, then we could keep working with RDA staff on that aspect of it, so.
We do other similar incentive-based programming with other departments throughout the city. And it seems like this would be a good one to not start with 100% and disappoint by ever having to go down, but be really clear about they know what advantages we are looking for in projects in terms of a citywide benefit, and that satisfaction of XYZ could lead to higher reimbursement. And I would love for staff to explore that if the board's interested.
Dan?
Yeah, and Danny, one of the things I really like about our loan model is that when you meet, the RDA staff did an incredible job of looking at when you hit certain benchmarks, you get a percentage break in that. And I'm wondering if we could structure this in a similar way for predictability, so that you know that if you are able to provide this goal that we're trying to accomplish, you get some sort of increased percentage, or you get something you can be sure of. I think that way it takes some of this sort of negotiating each project one by one out of the mix, and says, here's our agreed upon goals. We want you to strive towards these goals, and we'll incentivize that. So if that's something that's a possibility, I think that I really love the way the loan program ended up being structured, because it's very clear that you get a point break every time you hit one of those green energy goals or whatever it happens to be.
So board members, I want to straw poll this proposal that we look at a sliding scale of our participation and ask the RDA staff to come back to us with a proposal of what that would look like. Those in favor of that? Okay, it's unanimous.
And if I might make some suggestions, there's some really clear city policies that I think are good starting points. There's probably an employment component and a percent of higher salaries. But I think green energy is a really good one. It's been a priority for the mayor and the administration. If we can look at projects that really sort of double down on our commitment to being green and efficient, that should be something we're really encouraging investment in.
Great, thank you. Next one, we'll go back to the one that we were
4
on.
per year.
Yeah.
Get that settled.
That we were going to talk about. Does the board desire that?
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, and I know this is taking longer than you anticipated. Danny, what's the staff's capacity to process these? I mean, I think that's a factor as well. Are you comfortable with a number like where are we at? 4, I think we said. 4 a year. Is that something that if we really had 4 a year, does the staff have the capacity to process 4?
Yeah, that was an internal discussion we had, and we kind of looked at it and said, okay, if each of these took just 2 to 3 months each, that would basically be 1 per quarter. And we thought that was a good threshold to to set
You
initially.
know, all 4 of these will come in January.
I know. And I
Right, you
was- I
know
was just
that,
gonna say,
right?
The fact that
They
we
w-
said that, we're going to
It would be
bomb
lovely
right
if they
away.
were spread out one per quarter, but they will all come at the same time.
They will all come at the same time. But I mean, the good thing is if they all came at once and you could just do the same process 4 different times. So maybe that would be better. We'd get it done. But that was what we felt comfortable with, is that initial threshold. And if we end up being wildly successful, or that we get some really good projects that are above that 4, then obviously we would come back to the board and see if you had any interest in doing
Okay.
more, or, but we
Thanks.
felt that was just that.
So this
real-
is a number that the staff look,
Yes.
and that was a factor, your capacity
Yep.
to look. Okay, great.
Yes.
So those in favor of, I'm going to change this a little bit, of supporting the staff proposed limit to 4 projects per year, with the ability for the staff to come back to us if they want to do additional projects, and that be reflected in our policy. All in favor of that? For a year?
I appreciate you being concerned for my
Okay.
time.
Always come back to us, but
Yeah.
never
It's-
mind.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Jennifer?
The next is clarification of metrics. It came up in a few of the meetings that board members were interested in having sort of standard base metrics so that we could track whether it be either benefit or cost to the general fund, or whether it be wages of the employees based on what the company says and then actually what they do. There are some pretty robust reporting requirements that the RDA staff is suggesting in terms of the company reporting to the RDA board, but just wasn't clear to us that there would be base metrics across all projects. It said that the metrics would be established sort of on a case-by-case basis, which that probably makes sense for some of the metrics that, you know, maybe employment doesn't apply to a project or two. But maybe there are certain metrics that would apply regardless of what kind of project it was, and I don't know if the board wants more discussion on that.
Any thoughts on that, board members?
Danny, do you have any thoughts on the type of metrics?
I
you bring?
think within the program itself right now in section 5.2, you have the basic metrics right there. And then I think as we flush out the conversation regarding what additional percentage of increment, or how that increment would be tailored to what the goals are that they're going to address, I think we would also be addressing this problem between what's the base and what percentage does that get you, and what are the additional metrics and how much more increment could you get that way. So I think that would be addressed with that other topic.
Further questions?
I have a question that is sort of it's maybe a non sequitur with this particular issue, but in thinking about our average household income and all the talk about the high wage jobs being an incentive for us, but the reality of housing location not being in our favor, I wonder if the administration's had conversations or has ideas around incentivizing employment housing in the city, or creating some kind of whether it's a metric, I'm not sure if we're quite there yet, but how do we better capture the benefits of the high wage jobs? I mean, sales tax really doesn't do it for us unless they're going out to Ruth's Chris for lunch every day and spending a lot more on their lunch than most people are.
I think to get into the area where you're incentivizing housing for higher wage jobs gets us back to our earlier conversation of should we be allocating government resources to market rate and above housing. And I think that would be where that conversation is.
I don't
And
think it's
so-
quite about financial incentives. I wonder if there, and this is for another discussion, but is there some way, or is there some way that cities are asking companies to assist their employees in locating in the city that they're working in? And are there ways, besides us incentivizing financially market rate housing, are there ways for us to assist in that, increase from 10%?
I think it's something we can have that conversation and work with Laura in the Economic Development Department of what could we do in terms of our conversations with these companies of.
I don't doubt that other cities are asking that question also and
Yeah.
looking at ways to capture those employees in housing.
It's an important part of business recruitment.
So Danny, if I might just extend on that a little bit, Madam Chair, I can imagine incentivizing things like electric charging stations or a UTA pass program or some sort of shared ride program or sort of green things that we think would reduce the impact to some of our public services. I mean, ideally, I would love to see how we could capture housing opportunities for those higher paid jobs. The reality is that's going to be really challenging, but there may be ways to capture some other city priority benefits in the process, and I think those are very realistic, or they feel like they could be very realistic.
We could look at that as one of the metrics for capturing additional reimbursement percentage, if you like.
I don't know if we're there yet.
I don't know how we would get that, but
right.
we can look at, see if someone else has figured this out and
I think
come
there's
back
a
with an idea.
discussion between HAND and RDA probably, or within the Economic Development Department really, about how do we better capture and incentivize and place, and are other cities finding creative ways to do that?
It sounds to me like you have base metrics, but just so that we can be clear, I want to do a straw poll on whether or not we want to have standard base metrics and invite the RDA staff to come back to us with what those specifics would be. All in favor of that? Looks like we're unanimous. 6 in favor. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Jennifer.
And then the next one is related. It's defining key terms. This came up a couple of times in terms of in the small group meetings about, you know, what does job retention mean? If you're trading a high-paying job for a low-paying job, is that really job retention? And so Section 5.2 that Danny referred to is where all of the requirements are listed, but some of the terms, I don't know if the board wants to have discussion about what it means. I think most of them we've discussed and probably don't need to spend as much time on, but this concept of, let's see, 5.2b says the local business must demonstrate the project will result in job retention and or job creation. So I don't know if it's the term job that the board wants to discuss, or is it high-paying jobs? You know, is it 100% AMI or greater? Is it, I don't know. Those are some of the ideas that were thrown out in the small group meetings, and I don't know if the board had thoughts about that.
Is there a desire to be that specific, James?
You know, we classify housing, right? I think that job creation should be classified as well, whether it's 60, 80, 100% of AMI. I think it makes a lot of sense to see what kind of jobs are coming to the city. That way we can track base and figure out what kind of housing, if they are looking in the city or not for housing. So for me, classifying it would be.
And in the interest of, you know, presenting all sides, I think that one of the concerns that RDA staff raised in the small group meetings was that we don't want to be overly prescriptive. If there's this really great opportunity that in a particular neighborhood makes sense, we wouldn't want to necessarily lose that opportunity just for the sake of, you know, we were 2 percentage points short of the AMI or something like that. But I don't know if maybe tracking the kind of job payment, you know, for the year or two.
I guess just to top it off, I mean, we hear about Post Serial and UPS coming into the Northwest Quadrant. They're going to bring 1,000 jobs or 2,000 jobs. What are those jobs, right? I think a greater detail for us as a council to know if the investment was worth it or not.
So maybe starting with tracking the kinds of employment and then following up in a year with a policy discussion about what the council
What it looks
board
like.
would like to see going forward.
Okay, is there a desire to do that? Track it, and then in a year, look at it and have a policy discussion. All in favor? I'm feeling like Charlie back in 2014. I'm taking so many straw polls. You're right at home, huh? and well, we just want to make sure we've got it clear. Okay, Jennifer.
The next is somewhat related, the idea that companies report their performance based on the agreement. I think that because this is a yearly payment, the RDA has an extreme amount of leeway in terms of, you know, we don't have to pay them unless they, you know, prove that they have satisfied the terms of the agreement. But just trying to gauge the temperature of the board, how clear you want it to be in terms of, you know, will you claw money back if they've demonstrated, for example, that they've taken their jobs elsewhere? I don't know, worst case scenario. Or are there other provisions that if they don't meet the terms of the agreement, there's some sort of penalty or something like some sort of incentive to keep them on track meeting their agreement and reporting it?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
one of those for me, and maybe I need to look at the flow chart and you can tell me where this would happen, but if we approved it and they get into their investment and the capital work that needs to be done and things happen so that they aren't able to actually invest that 12 million, that things fall apart. Do we have it set up so that we absolutely would be aware of the actual investments at the time, annually, when we would be cutting the checks
Yes.
for reimbursement?
Yes, so what you typically do is you would structure the reimbursement agreement so that you would have the initial conditions that they would have to meet. And that would be verifying the cost for the total project, that they've made the investment and the building's done. And then you would also have your ongoing annual requirements that you would monitor, and those would be things that you tie to, are they maintaining potentially what their assessed value should be so that they can generate the increment? Do they have the jobs in place? Anything else that you've tied to your reimbursement of funds, you would be tracking that annually as part of actually cutting them a check. But that first requirement would be to make sure that the project investment was there.
And Danny, how long could they take to make that $12 million investment?
Usually give them up to a year, maybe a year and a half, depending on the scope of the project and what is required to bring it to fruition.
And would our reimbursement, I know that this could be contract dependent, but would the reimbursement begin once that investment is completed?
It's a completely performance-based, so they only get it if they generate it. And so it doesn't even kick in until it hits the tax rolls. And then it's a whole nother 15 months before we even get the dollars. And so we don't give them a dime until we as the agency have actually received that property tax increment.
Thank you.
Thanks for that clarification. All right, so does the board want to require in policy specific compliance standards beyond self-reporting that must be met in order to receive annual tax increment reimbursements? You are in favor of, yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
And maybe the question just needs to be, does the board support the RDA staff's proposal? Because it sounds like there's reporting.
That's so much easier. So, are you in favor of the staff proposal? Thumbs up? Okay, looks like we are in favor of that. 6 in favor, 1 abstention. And I just would ask a question, and do you think we need to discuss the clawback, or is that something you are looking at
What
anyway?
we would typically do is the clawback, as I would propose it right now, is you would tie that to whatever the percentage is that for those initial, for those additional metrics that you would want. And so let's say you started at 75%, and then they earn 15% more if they accomplish 3 of these provisions. To the extent that they didn't hit those thresholds, you would just reduce that reimbursement by that amount. And so that's how we would propose it if you want more detail on that, but we could write that into the next draft if you wanted to show that.
Would you do that?
Mhm.
Board members, are you comfortable with my asking that without straw polling it? Just
I'll say that I will want to understand better how critical or elemental those different provisions are, where some might be,
The requirements, yes.
even to be to the 75% may not be, or it may be excessive based on the lack of fulfillment of certain
Right.
provisions where others may not be as critical. So
Okay.
I'll just help me understand that when we get there.
And this is, I'm really not wanting to go off another track, but just a question that I have, and I don't know that it even plays in here, but I know a frustration in Sugar House was that there was a developer who was given RDA loan money and did development with the agreement that there would be public parking available. And as soon as the loan was paid off, that did not need to be provided for, and the loan was paid off quickly. So the public parking went from free or very little to $10 really fast. And that has been a huge source of frustration, and I think it was a loophole that no one realized was there, and I don't want to see us having that happen in the future. And I don't know if this is the right, it's dawning on me now, so it may not be the exact right spot to bring this up, but I think we want to be aware of that in the future, that when we're trying to benefit the community, that we aren't giving somebody it's like, they needed the loan, but all of a sudden they can pay it off really quickly if it means that they can start collecting parking fees.
And Madam Chair, if I may, I think, Danny, one of the maybe the challenges is identifying those public benefit issues that we work out a deal with the property owner that aren't tied to whether or not they have a loan with us. So in order to qualify for a loan, they need to have some agreement to provide these services. And so I think that situation that Lisa, which actually surprised everybody, I think, but that situation Lisa's referencing was just no one ever thought to separate the benefit from the financing mechanism. And so once the loan was paid, there was no legal obligation. So
Could do that. So, sorry I took us down that trail, but I have to say it when I think of it. Okay, Jennifer?
So the next one, I apologize if you guys have already discussed it. I was having some network trouble over there. The timing of the third-party verification. I know you've discussed having a third-party verification for every application. I wasn't quite clear so in the flow chart right now, the timing would be after the board adopts an initiating resolution. Then there's enough interest to go to the expense and trouble of hiring a third-party verifier. I can see the flip side that you might not know if you're interested in adopting a initiating resolution unless you know for sure that there's a gap. So I can see both sides of not wanting to spend the expense unless you're interested, and not knowing if you're interested unless you know that there's really a need there. So just didn't know if the board had already discussed the timing issue.
Board members, do you feel like we covered that sufficiently, or
if you're cool, or if you're okay with how the RDA staff has proposed it in the flow chart?
are you comfortable with the proposal in the flow chart? Which, by the way, thank you for that. That was really helpful, both in the small group and to have that today. I appreciate that. Okay, I'm not seeing concern about that,
the
right?
next two we've covered.
Yep.
So then annual reporting requirement is more of like an internal reporting requirement. This falls in line with a lot of the reporting requirements that the council has requested from other departments of just department activities. So just keeping track of the disbursements that are made, not just the deals that are signed, but annually what disbursements are made, so that that we can track funds. Obviously, you'll see it in the budget, but sometimes it's nice to have it in sort of a report, sort of like your land reports.
Do we want to have that in policy, that we receive a regular report? Any discussion on that? Okay, those in favor, thumbs up. And that is 6 in favor, and Derek Kitchen is absent for the vote.
And that would be an annual or annual?
And I was assuming annual, or if I'm incorrect, tell me. Okay. We'd like it every single month? No.
We can do
One
that.
person occupied
It'll
full-time
be boring, but
doing
we'll
that.
do it.
Yeah. Okay.
The next is something that was brought up in a couple of the meetings and is reflected in the RDA staff memo, that when the board considers the final approval of the final terms, the staff would provide a description of benefits to the local economy and potential concerns of the project before final authorization. That's in the staff memo, but it's not necessarily listed in the policy. And so, as staffs change and years go on, sometimes we go back to the policy and we're confused why what we intended isn't there. And so just wanted to know if it was important enough to the board to put in policy, or just leave it as a sort of staff practice.
Board members, would you be in favor of having this practice in the policy rather than just implied, so that the expectations are clear and can be applied consistently in the future? Those in favor of that in the policy? Thumbs up. And it is unanimous. Thank you very much.
And then a similar question with the pie chart. I think the RDA staff is recommending that they would include the flow chart as an attachment to the policy. This is probably a redundant question then, but if the board's in agreement with that, that would mean that if there's any change, you would actually have to amend the policy to change it, but sometimes that formalizes the process itself.
Well, I think it's also helpful for those who are wanting to see how we conduct business to look at that and to have access to that information. So I'm in favor of that. Those in favor of including the flow chart as an attachment to the policy? Thumbs up. Okay, unanimous. Thank you very much.
This one is sort of this is the last one. Yay. This came out of some of the small group meetings, and then board member Penfold mentioned it as well. This concept of there's quite a bit of public outreach that's done for larger community reinvestment areas. And in this case, because it's a single property community reinvestment area, there's not necessarily a